Welcome back, everyone. Demonstrations were largely peaceful across the United States overnight as hundreds of thousands of Americans continue to protest the killing of George Floyd. Now, as you can see, there were spurts of violence and destruction alongside passionate pleas to stop police brutality against Black Americans. The civic unrest began on May 25th following Floyd's death in Minneapolis. And it shows no signs of slowing down anytime soon. Let's bring in our Washington Bureau Chief Jackson Proskow. He's been following these protests extensively and joins us this morning with the latest. Good morning, Jackson. Thank you so much for taking the time. Right behind you, quite the ominous scene. Describe what is playing out right now.
Yeah, good morning to you, Anthony. We're about a block away from Lafayette Park, which is the park across the street from the White House, the scene of so many clashes, but also of peaceful protests over the past few days. And these are officers with the Federal Bureau of Prisons. They're riot control officers, members of what's known as the Special Operations Response Team. They're forming an expanded perimeter outside the White House this morning. But we should point out, it's perfectly peaceful. There are no protests going on this morning. This is just part of the enhanced police presence here in Washington that includes all these different federal agencies and, of course, military personnel as well.
How does the scene in Washington, when you look at overnight and you look at over the past few days, how does this compare to the protests across the country?
So I have to tell you, yesterday saw the largest but also the most peaceful protests we've seen so far, not just here in Washington, but really in cities right across the country. Yes, there were sporadic reports of looting in places like New York. Here in Washington, things remained perfectly calm throughout the evening, though, until about, 1 o'clock in the morning, when a very small skirmish with just a few people who remained broke out right along the fence line. They've added a 3-meter-high security fence at the park across from the White House. One thing that may have contributed to the growing sense of peace is the fact that there are curfews in place in most of these cities now. Here in Washington, for example, it comes into effect at 7 o'clock at night. That's so early that the few people who do stay out to defy it know that they've got to keep things calm or they are subject to arrest.
What has the response been? I mean, this has been controversial on so many levels. President Trump's remarks about bringing in the military and invoking the Federal Insurrection Act. Just give some background on what this means. And you hear the language that he is using to dominate protesters. Talk about that for a moment.
So Washington, D.C. is the one place in the U.S. where the military can be called in for a policing purpose without being asked. The federal government has oversight of this federal district, so they can just do it. So what we're seeing in this city is sort of a preview of what President Trump has threatened to do right across the country. And to give you a sense of what that looks like, we've seen military and National Guard Humvees patrolling the streets. We've seen military helicopters flying low over the streets as well, using their rotors and the wind from that to disperse crowds. These are all tactics you would not typically see here. The president may be slowly, quietly backing away now from his threat to militarize other cities if they don't get the situation under control, but also things do seem to be calming down. It is unprecedented, though, that the president would simply send in the military to these cities without being asked, and in fact, in many cases, over the objections of local mayors and governors.
Yeah, because he's facing a lot of backlash from the respective governors and mayors in terms of, their response. Also facing a lot of criticism in his tactics and language, I mean, obviously from Democrats, but from within his own party. Talk about and speak to how his response has been received politically.
There was a Republican caucus lunch yesterday. In fact, Republican members of the Senate were asked by reporters for a response to that incident that we saw earlier in this week when peaceful protesters were dispersed with gas canisters and with pepper spray right outside the White House so that the president could carry out that photo op. Not one senator stopped to offer comment, and most claimed to not know what had gone on. So I think the silence here is kind of deafening. It's not an endorsement of what the president's doing. It's not a rebuke either. In fact, I think many Republicans feel they've been put in a very tough and tenuous situation at a time, of course, when a coronavirus pandemic is running wild in this country, when unemployment is at a massively high number of 40 million Americans out of work right now, and now you've got this situation of civil unrest in the streets at the same time.
We'll be watching very closely to see how things play out today and the days to come. Jackson, we really appreciate you taking the time for us this morning. Jackson Proskow from Washington.